Welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. Karl Marx once famously said that philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. In this episode, Tom Costello from Socialist Alternative's Political Committee will give an introduction to the basics of Marxist philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of dialectical materialism, in a recording of a session recently held as part of our Revolutionary Ideas Socialist Festival in Liverpool. Before we move on to the episode, we'd just like to give a couple of quick plugs. First is our new pamphlet, The New Party We Need. This pamphlet sets out over 60 odd pages the type of New Left Party which is urgently needed to fight for working class interests and to resist the growing far-right threat that exists today. Secondly, Socialist Alternative now has a subscription service for our monthly newspaper. Please carry out a subscription today to get your monthly fix of socialist and working class analysis of events in Britain and elsewhere. To order your copy of the pamphlet or to subscribe to our monthly paper, go to socialistalternative.info. Now let's get over to the episode.
Okay, so this is a session about Marxist philosophy, and it's more generally about the philosophy of dialectical materialism. So I want to start by saying, if you've read the words dialectical materialism and you've thought, that sounds really difficult, what does that mean? You're definitely not alone. Likewise, I think when most people think of the word philosophy, what do they think of? They think of, academics sat in seminar rooms, kind of, chin stroking, trying to outsmart one another with arguments. And, that's intended as no offense to any academics in this room. But that is generally true for most of what gets taught as philosophy in universities. But dialectical materialism and Marxist philosophy is actually barely ever taught at universities. It's often dismissed in mainstream philosophy, actually, but that's because it's completely unlike all academic philosophy. It's a practical philosophy, and it's one that only makes sense when it's used as a practical guide to action. So what I really want to do over this introduction, and what I hope you'll get out of this session, this discussion overall, which is going to include a wider discussion, is two things. The first thing that, hopefully we can establish coming out of this meeting is that dialectical materialism and Marxist philosophy actually isn't anywhere near as difficult as the name would suggest. Anybody can understand it. And the second is that not only is it understandable, but it's actually an incredibly useful tool. It's a useful and practical guide to action for anybody who wants to change society. And so, I think the first thing to say before I go into it in more detail is, even if you don't think of yourself as knowing anything about philosophy, that doesn't matter in this session. That's kind of, irrelevant. Because the truth is, we take philosophical positions without knowing it all the time. Maybe you believe in the existence of a God. Maybe you don't, and you say there's no such thing as God, or you don't believe in a God. Maybe you take some sort of, in-between position and say you don't know. All of those are philosophical views, which, most people hold in some form. If you believe in science, for example, and you think the scientific method is a reliable way of arriving at the truth about the world, that's also a philosophical position. The assumptions we have about politics, the way that we think the world should work, all of that has some level of philosophy to it as well. And some people might ask, perhaps understandably, why do we even need a philosophy? What's the point in even having philosophy in the first place? Why do we have Marxist theory? Can we not just kind of get rid of all that stuff and just go with common sense, what happens to make sense to us in the moment? But that's still a philosophy. That in of itself is a position. That's a philosophical position. That's called the philosophy of pragmatism, which was a trend in philosophy a while back. But really, there's 2 points. The first is that everybody has a philosophy or some element of philosophy in the way that they think about the world. But also the people who say, get rid of that nonsense, get rid of that rubbish and just use your common sense. Often those are people who often, more often than not, just repeat back actually the philosophy of the ruling class, just without actually knowing it and without it being conscious. And that's why we say that the working class movement and the socialist movement needs its own philosophy, a philosophy to call our own. So what is dialectical materialism? What's its origins? Dialectical materialism is a fusion of two schools of philosophy, materialism and dialectics. So that kind of, that's a pretty simple way of explaining it right there. But when most people hear the word materialist in today's language, they usually take it to mean something different to what we mean in this discussion. If someone's a materialist, like to most people every day, it's somebody who's like obsessed with being rich, having a lot of like material possessions. A materialist is usually like a very shallow person. But when we talk about materialism in philosophy, we're using the word to mean something like completely different. So like forget about, the definition of it that we would normally go by. In philosophy, materialism is an outlook about what makes up the world around us. And it's often defined in relation to its opposite theory, which is called idealism. And we'll come back to these terms, so they will get clearer as the discussion goes on. Materialism and idealism are positions in philosophy basically on the question of what comes first, the material world or our ideas about the material world. What comes first, matter or mind? A materialist would say that what comes first is matter. Matter is primary in the world, and that our ideas about the world in our minds come from material things, from material processes. A materialist, for example, might say that thinking is a product of the brain, a material thing. A materialist might say that there is an external world independent of us, and it doesn't depend on us perceiving it. And that outlook is more connected with science, for example. Scientists would operate on some level of a materialist outlook. And for us, as well as Marxists, we see material conditions as the thing that determine consciousness, not the other way around. Idealism, on the other hand, turns that all around. Idealism, in its purest and most untainted form, would say that the world exists because we think it exists. They say that the world comes from our thoughts and our ideas. It puts emphasis on the subjective and subjective experience over and above the objective world and material reality. René Descartes, the French philosopher, I think in the 1500s, said, "I think, therefore I am." A Marxist would turn that round. They'd turn it upside down and say, "I am the product of my environment. I don't exist because I think I exist. I just exist because I'm in the material world." And these different outlooks have a political significance to them. If you're an idealist, which Marxists are not, Marxists are materialists, then that can take you, in all sorts of directions. Maybe an idealist would perhaps say, for example, that history should be understood in religious terms. Maybe an idealist would say that historical development, the development of history, is guided by God or some sort of immaterial spirit. Other idealists would have what we might call a great man theory of history, great men and great women theory of history. The great man and woman theory of history, for example, would understand this history, the history of this country, England, just in terms of its kings and queens. History is a history of kings and queens and, big personalities and military leaders and powerful individuals. But a Marxist, because Marxism is materialist, it rejects that theory. Obviously, individuals can play an important role in history. They can be important in history, and they often are important in history. Karl Marx and Engels are two important individuals in history. But we don't just leave things there. We ask the question, where do those important individuals actually come from in the first place? For example, Jesus Christ, probably one of the most significant figures in human history, really. He didn't come from nowhere. No, he came from the socio-economic conditions, the material conditions existing at the time in the Middle East, in ancient Palestine, under Roman occupation. The ideas that are now contained in the Bible are ultimately a reflection of material processes in society at its time. Likewise, did fascism come to power in Germany just because of the evil personality of a man called Hitler? No, as much as he obviously was a very evil man, we'd say that fascism came about because of the material conditions at the time in post-war capitalist Europe. Likewise, an idealist might say, if we get rid of this politician who doesn't care, doesn't kind of care about us, and we replace them with a kinder politician, things will sort themselves out. And again, Marxists would say, actually, what's key is struggle, class struggle, and ultimately changing the way that society is organized first. Getting rid of capitalism and replacing it with socialism. And that's a view which is rooted in a materialist outlook. So that's materialism. Let's go into dialectics now. The other side of dialectical materialism is dialectics. And dialectics is basically the study and practice of contradictions, using contradictions, understanding contradictions, and the effects that they have. And the philosopher in this tradition that Marx and Engels really kind of took their inspiration from was a guy called Georg Hegel, or you probably call him George Hegel, if you were to anglicize it. And he was a philosopher in Germany in the early 1800s. And Hegel wasn't a Marxist, he wasn't a socialist, he wasn't even a materialist, he was an idealist. So in many ways, he was very different to Marxism. But Marx and Engels saw something in his thought that they thought, we can kind of take this out and use this. This is useful. In particular, Hegel, he saw the unfolding of history as a dialectical process. All ideas that exist at a given point, the kind of zeitgeist of the time that we're in, isn't kind of fixed, but instead it's part of a wider chain of contradiction through history, through which things are developed. And Marx and Engels didn't agree with Hegel on lots of things. They didn't like the religious or idealist parts of his ideas. Also, Hegel is famously really, really hard to read. So, I think people try and then give up because he's really impenetrable. And famously, they placed Hegel upside down on his head. They kept the use of dialectics, but then replaced his idealism with a materialist outlook. And the result of that was a new theory. It was a new outlook and a new philosophy, which was based around three basic laws, which Engels put forward in particular. Three laws about how change and transformation take place in the material world. And I'm going to list these laws off. And again, you'll immediately get oh God, kind of feeling, which is completely understandable, but we are going to go through them in the discussion, and I will give a bit of explanation of them. So the first is the law of the negation of the negation. The second, and these are on the printout, so you're able to look at them, the law of the interpenetration of opposites. And third, the law of transformation of quantity into quality. And again, they sound really hard, but don't worry, we'll go through them. So I'm going to start with the negation of the negation, the first law. In the most basic terms, this law basically states that nothing is permanent. There's nothing eternal in this world. Nothing has an eternal existence, and everything is actually temporary. Everything in the universe has both a beginning and an end. And this is because things in the world, in the universe, in nature and in society, they're never fixed and they're never settled. Nothing is ever settled in a single state of being. Everything is also in a process of becoming, of turning from one thing into another thing. Heraclitus, who was an ancient philosopher in ancient Greece, said famously that it's impossible to step into the same river twice because it's always in a state of flux. It's always changing from one thing into another thing. Even the things that we could consider to be unchanged, that's not true. A human body, for example, or any living organism, is constantly made up of a process, even of cells dying and new cells coming into existence, things passing away and new things arriving in their place. And that's what's meant by negation, that everything has a force negating it, which will ultimately replace it, but then that new thing will have a new force that replaces it, and so on, and just, kind of infinitely. And Marx and Engels used that same method of understanding things and applied it to history. The conservative and non-Marxist view of history, for example, is that everything's static. This is the way it's always been. This is the way that it is now, and this is the way that it's always going to be, because that's just nature and that's fixed. Don't question it. Under feudalism, for example, the system which came before capitalism in England, but also elsewhere, there was this idea, for example, of the divine right of kings and queens. The idea that they were appointed by God. That's the way God has willed it. Don't question it. That's not going to change. But dialectical materialism, if that view, divine right of kings, is on this end of the spectrum, dialectical materialism is on the complete other end. It's the polar opposite, and it says that people like the kings and queens, and today the capitalist class, they're not eternal. They came from a process of revolutionary changes, negations, and so on, and they have a shelf life. They're only one link in the chain of history, and they will come out of existence. And Marxists understand that every other social system came and went, and we apply the same understanding to capitalism, even if it seems like it's a very fixed and stable system, although I don't think many people think it's stable, but fixed. Just as capitalism replaced feudalism, which itself replaced earlier forms of class society, ancient slave society, capitalism's now reached a point where it's no longer capable of taking humanity forward. And that's why we say it's now the job of the working class, the only force that has this organized power to ultimately negate it, to overthrow capitalism and replace it with a new and kind of higher way of organizing society, socialism. So that's negation of the negation. I'm going to move on now to the next law, which is unity and interpenetration of opposites. So informal thinking, which is thinking that's not dialectical, which doesn't understand and recognize contradictions, formal thinking would say there's no space for contradiction in the world. Things have to kind of fit in these neat, uniform categories and boxes. And contradictions are kind of seen in formal logic as something to be avoided or to be afraid of or to be resolved. But dialectical materialists, again, turn this around. Actually, we say not only, Marxists say, not only is the world made up of contradictions and opposing forces, but actually that's one of the most fundamental laws of the world, that all things contain their opposites in some form. And this law is about training us to look out for contradictions in both nature and society so we can understand the world more effectively. All things contain their opposites, and for that reason, all the time, lots of things that can be said always contain a grain of truth, but also a grain of falsehood to them as well. For example, formal logic would say that a statement can only ever be true or false, but dialectical logic would acknowledge that it's very rare that that's actually the case. There's all sorts of statements that can be true and false at the same time. For example, if you were to say Britain is a democratic country, well, it's true in one sense that you can vote every 5 years, we have the vote, but in another way, it's not true. Britain's an extremely undemocratic country in other ways. We have an inherited monarchy, an unelected head of state. We have bishops sitting in the House of Lords. We have the House of Lords, which is an undemocratic institution. And we're handed a choice between parties who are both only accountable to big business backers and lobbyists, and we have to wait 5 years before we can actually vote them out. So it's democratic and it's not democratic at the same time. And these are opposing forces which exist side by side, and that's what we mean by interpenetration of opposites in British society. The democratic vote was won through decades of mass movements and struggle, but we also see the fundamentally undemocratic nature of capitalism, of British capitalism. Understanding this law and applying it, consistently is actually how we can avoid having a materialist analysis that falls into a dogmatic and schematic view of things, and understanding actually that all sorts of strange things and peculiarities can actually emerge through history. For example, Leon Trotsky, who's a figure that I'm sure some of you all have heard of, most of you have probably heard of at least, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Well, about 15 years earlier, he actually used dialectical materialism, and especially this law in particular, the interpenetration of opposites, to analyze Russian society. And he developed his theory of a permanent revolution, which I don't really have time to go into. But the point is, he used dialectical materialism to look at the contradictions in Russian society, contradictions between the Russian economy, Russian culture, and the state. He looked at the mixture of a sort of ultra-reactionary monarchy, the Tsarist system, alongside the early development of capitalism in capitalist agriculture and industry, the intensity of repression, and also a new working class which had just come into existence and was especially, inclined towards revolutionary action. And he looked at all these things together and made the point that there's so many opposing and competing tendencies. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that just doesn't really fit together. And at some point, it's a bit like tectonic plates. At some point, there'll be, a moment at which there'll be revolutionary explosions. And as a result, he also saw the role of the working class in the coming Russian Revolution at the time, which was obviously proven to be correct in 1917. But we can also use this law in more kind of ordinary, like day-to-day ways, in our daily lives. Look, for example, at successes in the class struggle, victories or defeats in the class struggle. Every success contains its opposite. Every success has an element of a defeat or a failure to it in some form, but also vice versa. Every, maybe you've won a strike, for example, but you might see that there's mistakes made along the way, which meant that you almost didn't win. You almost ended up with a defeat. But vice versa, no failure is ever just 100% a failure, because you can see the opposite in that you've learned a lesson from your experience of defeat, and that can help educate future generations to lay the basis for victories in the future. So we see that in action on a more day-to-day basis. The last law, which I want to talk about, is the transformation of quantity into quality. So we've already touched on the fundamental point that everything changes, but this last law is more specifically about the nature of change. Okay, all things change, but how does change take place? Why does change take place in the first place? And the basic point here is that there are extended periods where only small changes will happen. It can seem like decades go by and nothing actually changes. But then those small kind of incremental changes lay the basis then for a rapid change, a revolutionary change. There's a quote, people actually say Lenin said it, but I'm not sure if he actually did, that there are years where nothing happens and then weeks where decades happen. An extended period of small changes followed by a revolutionary change, a rapid change, a transformation of quantity into quality. For example, there's the classic story in the Bible of the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's not just that one straw which breaks it, but it's the million other straws underneath it. And then finally, there's it reaches that tipping point where there's then that transformation from quantity into quality. But there's examples like this all over. I mean, we're an example of it, human beings. We're obviously a product of evolution and natural selection, but that can make it sound like evolution was this uninterrupted and slow, gradual process. It was always even. But the real record actually shows that's not true. The accepted version of events in science now, in biology now, is that over a relatively short period of time, actually, about 540 million years ago, there was a concentration of rapid changes. It was called the Cambrian explosion. And in this relatively small period of time, of 10 million years, but obviously within the scope of natural history, that's a short period of time. The planet went from being populated by only single-cell organisms, amoebas, bacteria, and so on, to complex organisms, the predecessors of like lobsters and crabs, and also the very distant ancestors of mammals, which obviously lead to us human beings today. And that was a revolution in natural history. And you can see a similar parallel in society. Society didn't just like gradually evolve from slave societies then to feudalism and capitalism in this like slow, gradual, and even way. It took place through breaks within previous systems, revolutions, out of which new systems emerged. Capitalism, and this is something that certainly doesn't really get taught in the history lessons at school, was a product of a revolution. Capitalism in Britain, the English Revolution in the 1640s. And that was a bourgeois revolution, one led by the capitalist class, the rising capitalist class against the monarchy. But also the history of capitalism is a history of class struggle. And that history is also made up of periods of small incremental changes, maybe within the consciousness of the working class, but also small incremental changes in the policies of the ruling class, which then explode into a period of heightened struggle, conflict, and transformation, and ultimately revolutions, which can pose the question of who runs society. So we've kind of laid down some of those laws, but I want to just give a few further examples which kind of point to how dialectical materialism can be a useful tool for understanding the world. So let's go through a few of them. So if we look at the wave of strikes which took place in Britain from 2022 to 23, British society and the working class in Britain was really a hotbed of dialectics. The workers who sat on the forefront of the strikes were the nurses for a period of time, but their main union, called the Royal College of Nursing, underwent rapid shifts, quantitative shifts, in the years running up to those strikes. I think until the year before actually the strike happened, their official policy was to not go on strike. They had a no strike pledge. We will never strike. But then, so they were essentially a conservative union who didn't fight at all. That was the idea, that the nurses would never go out on strike. It's impossible. That's not going to take place. And that's kind of in the name, Royal College of Nursing. It doesn't sound like a kind of fighting union. But you had all of these tensions and contradictions and changes building up underneath the surface, bubbling up underneath the surface. The sense on the hospital wards that real pay was constantly going down. The understanding that things were always getting worse and nothing was improving. Then a pandemic hits, which disrupts everything. And then the union votes at its conference to drop its pledge to never go on strike. They said, no, maybe we will go on strike. We're not going to rule that out. That's the transformation of quantity into quality, a concentrated shift over a short period of time because of the accumulation of those factors and those contradictions. But then there's the second law, the interpenetration of opposites. While nurses are going out on strike and fighting back on the picket lines, the existing leadership of the RCN is still that kind of older, more conservative leadership around Pat Cullen, who some of you might remember. She tries to sell a really crap deal, basically, to the workers that she signed with the Tories and get the nurses to accept it. But then the nurses, because of the contradictions which have built up, the experience of striking, a taste of their own power from being on the picket line, that leads them to say no. They form a rank and file health workers network called NHS Workers Say No, and they vote to reject that deal. And by doing so, they vote down that conservative leadership. And those tensions, which came to the surface and exploded really into public view, They won't have gone away. They just exist beneath the surface. They've gone back to the hospital wards. They've gone back into the branch meetings. But we understand that those tensions are still there, the dialectical tensions. And that's why we're part of all of our unions calling for a fighting approach, a militant strategy of strike action and also of trade union democracy. We use dialectical materialism to understand that every strike comes from a contradiction between the material interests of the working class, which is to, make a wage to survive and have, a decent standard of living. That's one side of the contradiction. But then the other side is the capitalist. Their interest is in keeping their profits up. While they keep their profits up, the workers' wages go down. So there's a heavy contradiction between the two. And those interests are opposing interests, which we see as, only being resolved or addressed through class struggle. And those aren't the only dialectical contradictions you see in a strike. There can be contradictions within the classes. Some of the capitalists, for example, might want to give a pay rise just to quieten people down, just to stop things kicking off. But then others will go the other way around and say, no, we need to dig our heels in and smash the unions, the kind of Thatcher type wing of the capitalist class. But likewise, there's also sometimes contradictions within the working class. Some workers are going to be ready to strike from the beginning, be more bold, more prepared to take the bosses on, the employers. But then some others might not be confident. They might not be willing to take that step, or they might not think, maybe we can't actually win anything in the first place. And that will take more patient work in order to convince them to be part of strike action. But these categories are always changing, they're always in flux, and they're always transforming, whether in small ways, quantitative ways, or sometimes in big ways and revolutionary ways. For example, if something happens in society, for example, like a mass protest movement or the downfall of a government that everybody hates, then that can lay the basis for a qualitative change, a change in the way that a worker sees themselves in relation to this system. Maybe the number of workers in that ready-to-fight camp will grow, and then they'll have an easier time dragging with them the wider layer of workmates who are a little bit more on the fence about, whether or not they should actually go out and strike. And I think the important thing is that a Marxist trained in dialectical materialism has to understand these types of contradictions and changes, always be looking and always be on the outlook for how things are developing, sometimes actually on a daily basis. What's the mood like in the workplace? Is it changed from yesterday? Has there been a turnaround? In what way have things changed? It's never the same as yesterday, and that's the important thing. But partly we are able to do this by studying history, by studying the class struggle, but also, of course, just as importantly, if not potentially actually more importantly, involving ourselves in the class struggle and being part of it, so we can be really the best fighters alongside other workers and win what working people need, but also to win working class people to our ideas, socialist ideas. So I'm going to summarize things now. In summary, dialectical materialism, the philosophy of Marxism, teaches that everything is in a process of change, and the driving force of those changes are contradictions. And because of that, changes in the material world, whether that be in society, society around us, or in nature, the natural world, are almost never just gradual. Changes take place through rapid shifts, shocks, revolutions, revolutionary changes, breaks in continuity and change. Under capitalism, for example, we're seeing in an extremely short space of time all sorts of meltdowns, extreme weather events, recessions, riots, political crises, revolutionary movements, across the world, and also shocks, just like with the election of Donald Trump in the US. Now, the reason we call it a philosophy is that it's general. We don't use dialectics, for example, in order to exactly tell the future. It's not like we can get the dialectics chart out and plot, this is going to happen a week from now. It doesn't work like that. And, so it's not this kind of exact guide. It's not this kind of exact science about how things are exactly going to develop. But the point is that it allows us to have a general sense of how things are going to develop, to understand the general laws of development and how things generally change. And on that basis, it allows us to develop a program, demands and a strategy which can arm us with an understanding of how we can change society towards socialism. But of course, the most important thing is that none of this is automatic. We are part of society. We are part of the world. We are part of history. And thus, it's actually on us as well, as workers, as young people, as socialists, to be active in the fight to change the world. And that really depends on us being part of our movements wherever they exist. So that's why we'd also appeal for you to join us and be part of our fight. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Revolutionary Ideas. We're going to make a special effort in the new year to keep these episodes coming out for you, so make sure to follow us on Spotify and SoundCloud. Give us a follow on social media too. On Instagram, we're socialistalternative.info. On Twitter /X, we are Socialist Alternative EWS. And lastly, on Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative, ISA, England, Wales and Scotland. Why not also get involved with Socialist Alternative yourself? Go along to socialistalternative.info and click Get Involved. Thanks, and see you next time.